Psychic Radio is now CBS Radio's The Sky. Back to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno. Call now 248-545-SOUL. New skyradio.com. Believe.
Is there a connection between the development of nuclear weapons and increased UFO sightings since the 1940s? Have UFOs or their occupants tampered with our nuclear arsenal? If there really are UFO occupants, who are they and where do they come from?
And welcome to the 142nd broadcast of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno. I'm Ben, and that UFO speculation you just heard came from my co-host and partner in the paranormal, my dad.
And let me start by wishing everyone in the United States who's listening a very happy Memorial Day and weekend, that is. And certainly tribute to our fallen veterans. And as I said on WOON the other day, if you happen to live in a country where you might have been speaking German or Japanese as an involuntary second language, you can thank our veterans as well as your own. Anyway, so let's get it right. Let's get it right to it, I should say. Making his first appearance on the show is Robert Hastings, who refers to himself simply as a UFO researcher and lecturer. Since 1973, he has interviewed former and retired military personnel for their knowledge of nuclear weapons-related UFO activity. He has presented his findings at over 500 colleges and universities nationwide since 1981. His father, a U.S. Air Force Senior Master Sergeant Robert E. Hastings, had indirect knowledge of such sightings at Malmstrom Air Force Base, Montana in 1967. That's what sparked Robert's interest in the subject. Robert received a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in photography from Ohio University in 1972. In the mid-1980s, he retrained in the field of electron microscopy and worked as a laboratory analyst, I should say, for Philips Semiconductors in Albuquerque between 1988 and 2002. He is now semi-retired and continues to lecture on the UFO subject. On July 18, 2008, Robert appeared on CNN's Larry King Live with three Air Force officers who spoke about their involvement in classified nuclear weapons-related UFO incidents. Find a link to that broadcast on the Talking Points page for this show at our show website, www.behindtheparanormal.com. Robert's book, UFOs and Nukes, Extraordinary Encounters at Nuclear Weapon Sites, was published in July 2008 and is available only at his website, www.ufohastings.com. That's ufohastings.com.
Robert Hastings, welcome to Behind the Paranormal.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so I guess I'll start off the questions here. So why do you feel that there's a connection between UFOs and nuclear weapons?
The Freedom of Information Act has been used to declassify hundreds of thousands of documents related to UFOs. Several thousands of those relate to UFO incidents at nuclear weapons sites going back at least to December of 1948, what the FBI and Air Force documents refer to as flying discs or flying saucers. Those terms were used interchangeably during that period, indicate that these disc-shaped craft were sighted dozens of times over a 2-year period, hovering over the Los Alamos labs where nuclear weapons were invented, Sandia Labs in Albuquerque, a weapons assembly site. Other documents refer to UFO sightings at the Hanford site in Washington State, which developed, created plutonium for the nuclear bombs, the one that was dropped on Nagasaki, as well as ones used in the Cold War. Other sightings were at Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee, again, a nuclear weapons site. So, according to the government's own internal documentation, which, by the way, never would have seen the light of day had the Freedom of Information Act not existed, does indicate a link between UFO activity and nuclear weapons sites going back almost to the birth of the nuclear age.
All right. What about all of the UFO sightings before the 20th century? What were they after?
Well, that's anyone's guess. What I point out to people is if one looks at worldwide UFO sighting reports going back to, let's say, the year 1900, there are sporadic sightings all over the globe of what we would now call UFOs. However, around the time that nuclear weapons were invented in 1945, suddenly sightings go through the roof all over the world. And, there's a phenomenon called waves of sightings, sighting waves. So levels of sightings around the world do go up and down, but they've dramatically increased as a whole, concurrent with the time that nuclear weapons came on the scene. And again, there is a definite link, according to the government documents and the persons I've interviewed. I don't think that UFOs, whoever's in them, are solely interested in UFO nuclear weapons activity. I think there's a diversity of reasons why they're operating here in our little valley, but it's quite clear based on the documents and the testimony that one of the things that they're quite interested in is the nuclear arms race. There are, by the way, I should add, declassified KGB documents that came to light after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, which confirm UFO activity in the former Soviet Union as well. So whoever are flying these things are quite interested not only in American nuclear weapons, but the Soviet weapons as well.
So,
okay.
Are you familiar with Project Paperclip?
I am.
Do you think there's any correlation between the UFO sightings and Project Paperclip?
Well, for those listeners who don't know what Paperclip is, it was the removal of rocket scientists, German scientists, to the United States, where they were engaged in weapons development in the United States, primarily with rockets in the Southwest. If the purpose of your question is to say whether there were sightings in New Mexico around sites where weapons were being tested, B-2 rockets, yes, those documents exist too, confirming that whoever were flying UFOs were very interested in weapons, future rocket as weapons, ICBM development in southern New Mexico. As far as whether or not German technology morphed into UFOs, no. There are 100 reasons why that simply is an implausible scenario.
Okay. Interesting.
Any more questions, Ben?
Oh, no.
Okay.
Well, enough for that for a moment.
Okay. Regarding the Freedom of Information Act, we have Stan Friedman, a good friend of ours, a guest frequently. I'm sure you know him. And he was one of the first to take advantage of these Freedom of Information Act opportunities to get UFO documents or UFO-related things. Excuse me. He is always very frustrated with the amount of the document that tends to be blacked out when he receives it. Have you had that experience too?
I found out very early on in the 1980s that I would have the door slammed in my face when I filed for information using the Freedom of Information Act. Dr. Bruce Maccabee was one of the lucky few early on before the door got slammed in everyone's face, where he did get a large number of quite candid documents from the FBI regarding, among other things, nuclear weapons related to UFO incidents. So I very early on, by about 1980, decided that I would be spinning my wheels and wasting my time trying to get information about the incidents that my ex-military sources were telling me in terms of UFOs hovering over nuclear missile sites, nuclear weapons storage areas. So rather than wasting my time in a futile effort, I have just concentrated on locating and interviewing the witnesses. You referenced the fact that when I was on Larry King in July of 2008, 3 former Air Force officers were on discussing nuclear weapons-related incidents. And so I have just focused on trying to find persons who were on the scene when these things took place. What I find interesting is that there's a group within the Air Force called OSI, the Office of Special Investigations. The people who were involved in nuclear weapons-related incidents or other incidents involving national security, they were almost always interviewed by OSI agents or other intelligence agents within the Air Force. And yet, so far as the public knows, this Project Blue Book ostensibly was the only UFO investigations group. None of these people were ever interviewed by Blue Book personnel, with rare exceptions, and none of the documents from the OSI or the other intelligence groups have been declassified involving UFOs shutting down nuclear missiles, for example, as many of my sources have attested to. So the actual documents that tell the story, that really get down to the nitty-gritty, are effectively exempt from the Freedom of Information Act disclosures. People who want the smoking guns really are just really going to be wasting their time if they think they're going to get the bottom line answers to FOIA requests.
Yeah. For the benefit of the audience, could you describe could you name the officers who were with you on the Larry King show and the incidents that they related?
Sure. My father was at Malmstrom Air Force Base in 1967 at a time when, according to several former or retired Air Force personnel, UFOs came in and hovered directly over our nuclear missile launch facilities, which are the underground silos where the missiles are kept, or what are called missile launch control facilities. The control facilities, each one of them controls 10 ICBMs. Now, we have the testimony of Bob Salas. At that time, he was a lieutenant. He was a deputy missile launch commander at a place called Oscar Flight. Each group of 10 missiles is designated Alpha, Echo, Oscar, what have you, and then a flight consists of 10 missiles. Mr. Salas has gone on the record as saying that he received a call down in the launch capsule when he was on alert duty from the guard at ground level saying, there's a saucer-shaped object hovering over the gate of the launch control facility. Before Mr. Salas could respond and say, in his words, "What have you been drinking?" suddenly his missiles began malfunctioning one after the other. Another incident occurred 2 weeks earlier at a place called Echo Flight, where after reports were received in the launch capsule of a saucer-shaped object hovering over one of the missiles, suddenly the entire flight of 10 missiles malfunctioned. Mr. Salas said that after this occurred, he and his commander, now retired Colonel Frederick Mywald, were whisked back to Malmstrom Air Force Base by helicopter, were debriefed by OSI, the same group I mentioned earlier, were told this was national security, were forced to sign non-disclosure statements, and told never to discuss the topic again, even among themselves. Mr. Salas, in the 1990s, mid-90s, felt that the American public, and indeed the rest of the world, had a right to know the facts, that UFOs were real, that they were hovering over missiles at a time when missiles were malfunctioning. And at that point, he went public and talked about all of this. Now, the other officer who was on, the second officer who was on Larry King with me is named Bob Jamison. He, too, was a lieutenant at the time. He was what's called a combat targeting officer. He was sent out to respond to the shutdown of the Oscar flight, all 10 missiles being mysteriously inoperable. And Mr. Jameson told me that before they went to the field, they were briefed in the missile maintenance hangar and told that UFOs were indeed involved in the shutdowns, that they were to report any UFO activity they observed in the field. Mr. Jameson said that if a UFO appeared while they were starting the missiles up again, they were ordered to go into what's called the personnel access hatch to go underground until this object left the scene. Very explicit testimony from these two officers describing this incident at Oscar Flight in March of '67.
Okay, we're going to have to break for a commercial here. But stay with us, please, everyone. We're talking with Robert Hastings, UFO expert, and especially in the matter of UFOs and nuclear weapons and what may have occurred. We'll come back. We're going to talk about a bit about the Rendlesham case, which we have been very, very open with about this on this show for the anniversary, 30th anniversary of that particular incident. And we'll be right back here on Behind the Paranormal, CBS New Sky Radio. Stay with us.
CBS Radio's The New Sky. NewSkyRadio.com. Across the Veil with April Lugo.
Join April Lugo each Tuesday night at 7 for Across the Veil. Across the Veil is a show that promises to be a unique experience as April connects and communicates with those who are across the veil. April receives guidance and wisdom from the ancients, angels, masters, teachers, and guides, as well as hearing messages from those who have preceded us across the veil, family, friends, and loved ones alike. The program is an excellent opportunity for you to hear from those who are across the veil. April will be answering questions and giving insight. That's the main reason for the program. Across the Veil at 7 Tuesday on The Sky.
Look up to the sky. Psychic Radio is now CBS Radio's The Sky. Reach out. NewSkyRadio.com.
How the hell do we wind up like this? Why weren't we able to see the signs that we missed? Try to turn the tables. I wish you'd have end up staying. Now the story's played out like this, just like a paperback novel. Let's rewrite an ending that fits instead of Hollywood horror. Nothing's wrong, just as long as you know that someday I will. Someday, somehow, gonna be alright, but not right now. I know you wonder anyway. Yeah, you only wanna know that. Someday, somehow, gonna be alright, but not right now. I know you wonder anyway. Yeah, the only one who knows that. How the hell do we wind up like this? Why weren't we able to see the signs that we missed? Try to turn the tables. Now the story's played out like this, just like a paperback novel. Let's rewrite an ending that fits instead of Hollywood horror. Nothing's wrong, just as long as you know that someday I will. Someday, somehow, gonna be alright, but not right now. I know you wonder anyway. Yeah, the only one who knows that. Someday, somehow, gonna be alright, but not right now.
Psychic Radio is now CBS Radio's The Sky. Back to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno. Call now 248-545-SOUL. New Sky Radio.
Indeed, with our special guest this evening, Robert Hastings. Ben and I are here, and we're talking about UFOs and nuclear weapons and the particular interest that these critters seem to show in our nuclear arsenal. Now, let me just ask you, point out a few things here from our own experience here, Mr. Hastings, and that has to do with the Rendlesham Forest case of 1980, of which this is the 30th anniversary year. And we are one of the anchor shows for the 3-hour specials that have one of which has been aired. Another one's coming up on June 20th here on CBS New Sky. And we are very interested in the final day of the incident. We've had a number of witnesses. We have Colonel Hall, to Larry Warren, with John Burroughs, a number of other people. We're going to be having Jim Peniston and several others. And they all, it's funny, when you mention that third day in which the UFO supposedly came over the base and shone beams of light, apparently, down onto the bunkers that were not supposed to contain nuclear weapons, everybody kind of clams up. Now, admittedly, legally, those weapons were not supposed to have been there if there were nuclear weapons there. But can you give us any reason or any motivation, if you can think of any, if in your studies that you may have come upon, for these UFOs or their occupants to be shining these beams down onto these things? Have you heard of that in other cases? And if so, what do you think it means?
Well, first of all, I know from my own research as well as declassified documents that sightings at weapons storage areas, they're called WSAs, go back to literally 1949 in Texas, Killeen Base, which was the Air Force's first nuclear bomb storage depot. Sightings have occurred at other weapons storage areas all around the country. I've got case after case in my book where witnesses who were stationed there guarding the sites were aware of these incidents. The case at Rendlesham Forest, or actually RAF Bentwaters, I've interviewed Colonel Hall. I've interviewed over a dozen other persons who were on the base at the time, either weapons storage area guards or persons who were in the air traffic control tower who were tracking UFOs traveling at phenomenal speeds. The incidents described by Hall, he first talked about them on television in 1991 on the Unsolved Mysteries program. He very cryptically alluded to one of the UFOs that hovered above him in Rendlesham Forest when he and a team of security police were looking to find the source of these strange lights that were being reported. He said one of the UFOs was racing around the base, firing down these beams of light. He was miles away, but he could hear on his two-way radio that guards at the weapons storage area were reporting beams of light coming down in their vicinity. I've also interviewed a colonel who I cannot identify for you, but he was very high up in NATO weapons security. He told me that actually after that incident, 2 tactical bombs, which were stored in the bunkers, were removed from Bentwaters and flown back to Kirtland Air Force Base for inspection to see whether there had been any effect, any damage to them from presumably these beams that were observed. Now, Colonel Hall is going to be one of the people who would be participating in a press conference that Bob Salas, Mr. Salas again, was the missile launch officer at Malmstrom in '67. He and I are going to have 8 or 10 former and retired Air Force personnel at the National Press Club on September 27th, including Colonel Hall, discussing nuclear weapons-related UFO incidents. The only other parallel that I'm aware of where beams of light, per se, were observed coming down into a weapons storage area actually came from the Soviet Union in July of 1989, according to a declassified KGB document, a site called Kapustin Yar, which is, among other things, a nuclear missile test base. According to these declassified KGB files, a saucer-shaped object was observed hovering over a building, a facility that contained nuclear missile warheads, firing down beams of light onto the roof of this structure. So the parallels are exact, and you have saucer-shaped objects firing beams of light down into weapons storage areas. I suspect things have happened at other weapons storage areas, but the testimony that I have from my own sources just suggests that these objects hovered over the other weapons storage areas. No one I've interviewed can say that beams were observed, except in the case of the Bentwaters incident and then the case in the Soviet Union that I mentioned.
Okay. Now, here comes, I suppose, what might be the ultimate or one of the ultimate questions. Who do you think who are these people? Or if they're UFO occupants, or are these remote control crap? I mean, who's doing this?
What I have told my lecture audiences now for nearly 30 years is if you look at the empirical data, not the anecdotal data, not the sighting witness reports, but the empirical data for UFOs, basically you're looking at radar data and some landing trace data. The radar data confirm, for anyone who's familiar with the Washington July 1952 incidents, that objects have been maneuvering in Earth's atmosphere since the late 1940s that are capable of flying thousands of miles per hour, stopping on a dime and hovering, or doing literally 90-degree turns. No country on Earth, even in 2010, has such aircraft. And so, in my view, you're left with the fact that we're dealing with somebody from somewhere else. For years and years and years, scientists have said, no, even if aliens are out there, the distances between star systems are so vast that they could not possibly be coming and going with the frequency that UFOs are reported. However, in recent decades, there's new theories of the universe involving what's called higher dimensional space, hyperdimensional space, that are a higher dimensional space that are being taught at major universities by leading theorists. And in the new and improved view of the cosmos, faster than light travel is indeed possible. Time travel is possible. All the things that the traditional scientific community said were, absolutely nonsense are now being taught as the likely way the universe operates. So I think, given the fact that you have data going back showing objects operating not only in the U.S. but all over the world that are just orders of magnitude beyond any aircraft we have even now, coupled with the fact that science itself now says that interstellar travel probably is indeed possible, I suspect we've got a number of races, beings from different worlds, who probably travel all over the place, and one of the places they're interested in, for whatever reason, is little old planet Earth. And all that is speculative and theoretical, but the documents released from the government and the testimony of my sources and other witnesses who were involved in the nuclear cases clearly indicate that at least one group of beings, one group of people flying around in UFOs, they have an ongoing interest in monitoring nuclear weapons and quite clearly have tampered with them from time to time, not only here but in other countries.
Okay, well, that's well articulated, by the way. What about the theory that these are people from our future? Or even some unknown distant past?
Time travel, according to theorists, do say, that is in the realm of possibility. So it's not out of the question that some of these incidents involve humans from the future. That's theoretical, but it's in the realm of current scientific thinking. What I point out is really beginning in the fall of 1954 in France, there have been many, many incidents, thousands of credible observers, law enforcement personnel, and others reporting landed UFOs with little critters walking around them. And if you weed out the questionable of those reports and just focus on the ones where you have multiple observers, 2 or 3 cops or what have you reporting these objects and these occupants, what you're left with, or what you're struck by, is diversity of the physical forms that are being described. Some beings are described as quite human in appearance. Some are 3 feet tall with large heads and big black eyes. Some are 7 feet tall. So you have a range of morphologies or physical types that, to me, suggest we're dealing with different races from different worlds and quite possibly humans from the future. I mean, that certainly can't be ruled out, but the physical forms that are being described seem to be different evolutionary tracks, and quite clearly based on their UFO technology, they're thousands, if not millions of years ahead of us in terms of their abilities.
That's a very interesting point for us, because in our paranormal work, we take an entirely different view than the usual circus-type ghost hunters and stuff. We operate entirely on the theory that we're dealing with multi-dimensions, multiple worlds, a la some of the interpretations of quantum mechanics. And we run into, in quote-unquote ghost cases, the very beings that are often described in the UFO cases.
Right.
And even others. I mean, we have a house in Connecticut where there are rectangular-shaped guys with funny legs jumping by the windows, and very tall people moving down the hall, and I find that's perhaps a subject for another show, but very interesting nevertheless. What evidence do you have? I mean, there's certainly evidence, obviously, that there has been some circumstantial evidence of tampering with UFOs. Have you heard of any results of tests of these weapons after they have allegedly been tampered with, and what the nature of the tampering might have been?
The majority of the reports that I've received from my missile maintenance sources or missile targeting sources, even the launch officers like Bob Salas, and this is at different Strategic Air Command bases, Air Force bases, from the 60s through the 1980s. The majority of reports I'm getting is that after the UFO is sighted above the missiles and they malfunction, what is found is what is called the GNC, guidance and control systems, are basically shot. They actually have to replace the hardware that would allow a missile to find its target, it would be guided to its target. A variation on that is that the targeting codes themselves, sometimes referred to as targeting tapes, which have coordinates on the Earth, longitude, latitude, where the warheads are supposed to land, those have been allegedly scrambled or erased altogether. I've gotten a handful of reports of that. Those are the primary modes that are being reported by the people who are actually in these squadrons, who either replaced the components themselves or heard from someone else in their squadron about what they found on another missile in terms of erased targeting tapes. So it seems as if whoever they are trying to demonstrate, in my view, that they have the ability to interfere with a nuclear missile launch. There is if one goes and Googles launch in progress, in quotes, launch in progress, and then maybe my name outside of the quotes, you'll find a 2-page statement by a former missile launch officer named David Schuer, who was at Minot Air Force Base, North Dakota in the mid-'60s. And unlike all the other witnesses that I've interviewed who say that the missiles were basically shut down, Mr. Shore said that his missiles were actually temporarily activated, and according to their display panels down on the launch capsule, were preparing to launch, and they had to inhibit the launch by pressing or flipping rather what's called an inhibit switch. Now, just recently, a second Air Force officer named Larry Manross, who was at Minot 2 years after Mr. Shore was, in 67, 68 time frame, said a virtually identical thing occurred in his launch capsule. If you go again and look for parallels across the ocean,
I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap for another break, but we're going to come back to this fascinating topic in just a moment. Stay with us, Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno, and our guest, Robert Hastings. Be right back.
CBS Radio's The New Sky. NewSkyRadio.com. This is the Lisa J. Smith Show.
Hi, this is Lisa J. Join me for Lisa J. Now at 3 o'clock Eastern on CBS Radio The Sky. I'm bringing to you some great guests, numerologists, angel card readings, and more. That's at 3 o'clock Eastern on CBS The Sky.
Look up to the sky. Psychic Radio is now CBS Radio's The Sky. Reach out, NewSkyRadio.com.
Hello, baby, hello. Haven't seen your face for a while. Have you quit doing time for me? Or are you still the same spoiled child? Hello, I said hello. Is this the only place you thought to go? Am I the only man you ever had? Or am I just the last surviving friend that you know? Harmony and me, we're pretty good company. Looking for an island in our boat upon the sea. Harmony, gee, I really love you, and I wanna love you forever. I dream of never, never, never leaving harmony. Harmony, gee, I really love you, and I wanna love you forever. I dream of never, never, never leaving harmony. Hello, baby, hello. Open up your heart and let your feelings flow. You're not lucky knowing me, keeping the speed real slow. In any case, I set my own pace by stealing the show. Say hello, hello. Harmony and me, we're pretty good company. Looking for an island in our boat upon the sea. Harmony, gee, I really love you, and I wanna love you forever. I dream of never, never, never leaving harmony. Never leaving harmony. 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 Harmony.
Psychic Radio is now CBS Radio's The Sky. Back to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno. Call now 248-545-SOUL. NewSkyRadio.com. Believe.
And we are back again with our marvelous guest today, Robert Hastings, and we're talking about UFOs and nuclear weapons. And Robert was describing various effects that apparently have occurred when UFOs have intervened or tampered with nuclear weapons. And you were saying, Robert, that there were some missiles that were activated temporarily, and there were some whose guidance systems were messed with. And I find this strangely disconcerting because it doesn't seem that they were interested in any way deactivating the warheads themselves, but in what, changing the targets? I mean, what are we looking at here?
Well, in my view, and in the view of some three-quarters of the persons I've interviewed, and we're over 120 at this point, former and retired Air Force personnel, 75% of them agree with what I'm about to say. They think that whoever these beings are, in effect, are trying to tell the superpowers, the nuclear weapons states, including the U.S. and Russia, that having nuclear weapons is like playing with fire. We're risking not only the end of human civilization, but an ecological disaster on the planet in terms of all of the radioactivity, which lasts for thousands of years in the atmosphere and the soil and so on. So in our view, whoever they are, in effect, are demonstrating that they are quite displeased with the nuclear arms race. They obviously are not sitting down on the White House lawn or in the Kremlin courtyard and saying in no uncertain terms, get rid of nukes. The approach seems to have been more subtle, but it's definitely going on behind the scenes. I have testimony as recently as 2008 at a weapons storage area called Area 2 at Nellis Air Force Base by a former security policeman talking about UFO activity there. So it went on in the 40s. It went on in, as recently as 2 years ago. David Shore, to finish a thought, that the launch officer who was at Minot when his missiles were temporarily activated, is of the opinion that that was not deliberate. Whoever was in the UFO was not trying to launch nuclear missiles. But he thought that there was some scanning of the hardware going on and that the missiles were temporarily activated inadvertently. However, I know that something quite identical, similar anyway, occurred in the former Soviet Union. A journalist named George Knapp, he was the person who first interviewed Bob Lazar of Area 51 fame. Mm-hmm. In the early 90s, George Knapp went to the former Soviet Union and taped, I think, hundreds of hours of videotape with Soviet Army personnel, former Soviet Army personnel, about UFO activity in that country during the Cold War. And one of the incidents that came to light was in October of 1982 in Soviet Ukraine, where a UFO was sighted above a Soviet nuclear missile installation, and apparently for 15 seconds, suddenly the missiles were activated just as this object was hovering over the missile site. And while the launch crew was frantically trying to shut down the launch sequence, they had no luck in doing that whatsoever. And then after 15 seconds, everything returned to normal. So what these gentlemen described to George Knapp is virtually identical to what David Shore told me took place in North Dakota in the mid-'60s. I think at the very least, the implications are that someone's just trying to scare the hell out of people who are using nukes. Now, the American public and the Russian public never heard about these incidents, but when these officers were debriefed, their commanders and the OSI agents or whoever took the reports in the Soviet Union, excuse me, were, all those reports got kicked up to the Pentagon and or the Kremlin. And so the message was, sent to the people at the highest levels of power in each country that, hey, somebody's trying to send us a message. And, we just had a very near disastrous kind of situation here, seemingly. So I think, again, the idea is that whoever are flying these craft are trying to get the attention of Washington and Moscow and say, look, this is suicide for your race and your planet if you keep, deploying nukes and threatening to use them.
Mm. Okay, well, Ben has a couple of questions here.
All right, so this leads to the question, are they trying to protect us or themselves?
Well, that's anyone's guess. I have jokingly, but I have said to people in my lecture audiences, we have no guarantees that these are aliens planning to invade Earth, and they simply don't want to inherit a radioactive planet, and therefore that's why they're doing what they're doing. Now, I don't think that's true, but I don't think that anyone outside of a handful of people in the Pentagon and the Kremlin really know what the bottom line answers are, so that's certainly in the realm of possibility. It could also be argued that at the end of World War II, not only did we have suddenly out of nowhere nuclear weapons, but we also were developing rockets that would take us into space. And one might say that these races are saying, they're no threat to us now, but at some point these humans could be a threat to us. I think that's probably an implausible scenario because they are so, many, many years ahead of us, and they don't really view us as a threat in that sense. What the best evidence suggests is that they are, in effect, trying to keep us from committing mass suicide by using nuclear weapons. And I think that's the best scenario based on what we know about the situation.
Okay. And this next question, I guess you pretty much touched on it, but perhaps you could
elaborate a little bit more on, besides like Great Britain and like United States and Moscow, are there any other countries that have UFO intervention?
Sightings have been reported near nuclear missile sites in France. I'm aware of testimony relating to that. I'm also aware of UFOs being sighted at nuclear testing in the South Pacific being conducted in French Polynesia by the French back in the 1970s. There's testimony on record about UFO sightings during that. I have a whole chapter in my book, UFOs and Nukes, in which ex-Navy veterans, U.S. Navy veterans, are talking about UFO activity, sightings during American tests of hydrogen bombs, where objects were being sighted just days before the detonation of the first hydrogen bomb, and then during certain subsequent tests. There was actually a Defense Nuclear Agency document that was apparently inadvertently declassified. Somebody didn't read all this 500-page document well enough to censor this, but in April of 1954, during what's called Operation Castle, there was a UFO sighting of an object that flew directly above the primary nuclear weapons task force vessel, the USS Curtis, which had aboard all the nuclear scientists from Sandia Labs and Los Alamos. It was also the vessel that was transporting the hydrogen weapons to the South Pacific for the tests. And during one of these tests, what was described as a luminous oval-shaped object buzzed the ship. And a researcher named Dan Wilson and I tracked down some of the sailors and Marines who were on board, and they said it was quite clearly a UFO. And when it cleared the vessel, it did a series of zigzag maneuvers. So we have eyewitness testimony of UFO activity during American testing of nuclear weapons in the South Pacific.
Okay. I'm a Coast Guard veteran, so I tend to be kind of nautical, and I was going to ask you if you had run into incidents such as you just described, and also USOs. We're almost coming up on a break here, but we might get back to that after we come back. But the USOs, unidentified submerged objects, or that sort of thing, even coming after nuclear vessels, nuclear-powered vessels, or vessels that were carrying nuclear weapons. Have you run into that?
Not in the latter case, no. I'm aware of reports of objects bursting out of the ocean, saucer-shaped objects.
Sure, yeah.
I think quite clearly these craft do have an undersea capability. I've interviewed one Navy sonar man who said he was picking an object.
Okay, we got to wrap. We couldn't catch him in the Coast Guard, and I guess we can't catch our luck here with these breaks. But we'll be right back on Behind the Paranormal with Robert Hastings, and we'll continue our discussion of UFOs and nukes. Stay with us.
Psychic Radio. PsychicOnAir.com. The wake-up call with Ellen Tom.
Put your hands on either side of his face. Maybe sit on his lap. That might get his attention. And say, honey, you're hurting me.
Yeah.
And I know you don't want to hurt me, but you're hurting me so much that I don't want to come home anymore.
Hi, it's Tom Force. Reverend L. Newman and I are here Monday nights, 7 till 9, prime time, Eastern time in the United States, with Wake Up Call on Psychic Radio.
Psychic Radio. We know you're listening. Life is a journey. Let us be your guide. Reach out on the net now, psychiconair.com.
Look for Psychic Radio on your AOL radio player.
Girl, she puts the color inside of my world, but she's just like a maze where all of the walls are continually change, and I now I'm starting to see maybe it's got nothing to do with me. Fathers, be good to your daughters. Daughters will love like you do. Girls become lovers who turn into mothers. So mothers, be good to your daughters too. Oh, you see that skin? It's the same she's been standing in since the day she saw him walking away. Now she's left cleaning up the mess he made. So fathers, be good to your daughters. Daughters will love like you do. Girls become lovers who turn into mothers. So mothers, be good to your daughters too. Boys, you can break. You find out how much they can take. Boys will be strong, and boys don't you wrong. But boys would be gone without one from a woman's good, good heart. On behalf of every man, looking out for every girl, you are the God and the weight of the world. So fathers, be good to your daughters. Daughters will love like you do. Girls become lovers who turn into mothers. So brothers, be good to your daughters too. So mothers, be good to your daughters too. So mothers, be good to your daughters too.
Psychic Radio is now CBS Radio's The Sky. Back to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno. Call now 248-545-SOUL. New skyradio.com.
Me, it seems that an advanced civilization would be one with spiritual advancement. Perhaps advancement in the sense of using the mind, advancement in the sense of being able to access parallel worlds, other dimensions for the benefit of themselves and their race, as shamans supposedly do, and not necessarily to be, hopping star systems and trying to help people who are at the danger of being destroyed by nuclear weapons. Now, I suppose the altruism is good if that's what it is. I don't know. I'm struck by that. Are these really advanced beings, do you think, in the sense that I just described? I mean, what say you about all this? I mean, does technological advancement equal a real advancement? I don't know. I just have a philosophical problem with that assumption.
I'll harken back to what I said earlier about the credible sightings, not the abduction reports where people have to use time regression hypnosis to recall the events more often than not. But the cases just involving eyewitness sightings of landed disc-shaped objects, and then occupants of one description or another walking around or being sighted through windows aboard the craft and so on. If you look at the best cases, probably thousands by now since the 1950s, you're again left with a very clear implication that there are multiple races, various races from different worlds based on their very distinctly different morphologies or physical appearances visiting here. So if indeed that is what's going on, that we have multiple races from different places visiting us, one might reasonably predict that their evolutionary paths in terms of their cultures and their beliefs, their religious beliefs, social systems and such, would vary, widely, conceivably, from world to world. So some of them visiting here may have our best interests at heart. Others may have nefarious motives. Others may just be dispassionate anthropologists. In other words, they're here to observe, not to engage in any way. There could be any number of scenarios going on simultaneously if, in fact, there are beings from different worlds. I think it's almost an unanswerable question at this point in human history until some of them openly acknowledge their presence here and begin communicating with humankind in an open way. We're really not going to know what their motivations are, what they believe, what they fear, what drives them to do what they do.
Well, an unanswerable question, but you answered it very sensibly from our point of view, certainly, at least.
Yeah.
Well, please tell us about your book.
UFOs and Nukes is available at my website, ufohastings.com. It's 600 pages of interviews with former and retired military personnel, persons for the most part who were told never to talk to anyone about what they witnessed, what they were involved in. Fortunately, like myself, they believe the American people and people everywhere have a right to know the facts, and so they have agreed to be interviewed by myself and to go public with their stories. What I point out to skeptics and journalists, people who are a little dubious about all of this, is that, every last one of these people were entrusted by the U.S. government to either operate or guard weapons of mass destruction. These are former missile launch officers, targeting officers, maintenance missile personnel, and missile guards who are talking about UFOs monitoring U.S. nuclear weapons since the 40s onward, as recently as 2008. And from time to time interfering with the functionality of those weapons. If the U.S. government entrusted these people and vetted them psychologically and their backgrounds to entrust them with, working with nuclear weapons, I think one has to sit up when 120 of them independently come forward and say, look, UFOs shut down my nuclear missiles, or UFOs hovered over my nuclear weapons storage area and fired beams of light down into it. These are not flakes. These are not kooks.
Yep. Well, we're flat out of time. And, Robert, thank you for a fascinating and riveting conversation.
My pleasure.
Very good. And we'll talk to you soon.
Have a good one.
Okay. All right. Ben, take it away.
All right. So don't forget our next 3-hour Rendlesham Forest UFO broadcast. We're planning another panel discussion, this time with some different former USAF witnesses. And we'll have Larry Warren back, but also Jim Peniston and John Burroughs. That will be on Sunday, June 20th, when we will again combine shows with our friends Dave and Tom Jones from CAPS Paranormal here on CBS New Sky Radio Sunday lineup.
Okay, and also remember our website, show website, behindtheparanormal.com. You can check out our current guests, former guests, upcoming shows, and you can buy my books. Hear that? Buy my books from right there on the main page. You can subscribe to our little weekly newsletter, which will inform you what's happening. And you can apply to become a reporter for the show. We have field reporters, 5 of them at the moment, who can call in, let us know what's happening in your neck of the woods, paranormally speaking. And also we have them out. We're looking for cases for our upcoming, hopefully, TV series.
You can find all our podcasts of all our shows available at newskyradio.com or at our show website, www.behindtheparanormal.com.
Okay, and many thanks to our producer, Will Kosnick. We'll see you right here next Sunday, June 6th at 7 Eastern, 4 Pacific on CBS New Sky Radio. And we will have a rebroadcast that week because it is Ben's high school graduation day, and we're going to take the day off. So. All right. Anyway, it's all right here on CBS New Sky and at newskyradio.com. Stay tuned now for CAPS Paranormal with our good friends Dave and Tom Jones.
All right, so check out our new Monday show at 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 Pacific on WON 1240 AM in southeastern New England and onworldwide.com. Also, you can hear rebroadcasts of Behind the Paranormal on Saturdays at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 Pacific, right here on CBS New Sky Radio.
Okay, that's it for this week. We'll see you next week.